They told the public these people were monsters, mistakes, proof of God's humor. Posters sold the shock, but never the truth. Some of these legends were real, some were staged, some were complete inventions that fooled the world. Tonight we open a set of photos that were never meant to be explained, only believed. In an era when most people with severe physical differences were shut away from public life, Johnny Eck did the most radical thing possible. He stepped into the light. Born in 1911 without the lower part of his torso, he entered entertainment not as a charity case, but as a man determined to make a living on his own terms. He appeared in Browning's Freaks and later in Tarzan films, moving with precision and intent, not with resignation. Offstage he painted, played music, worked with magicians, and built a career rather than receiving one. He lived by doing what countless others with his condition never got to do, deciding for himself. People first looked at him out of shock. They remembered him out of respect. Before cinema created celebrities, a little boy from Connecticut crossed oceans to perform before thrones. Under the name General Tom Thumb, Charles Stratton was dressed, staged, and sold by Barnum, yes. But he also learned to master the stage that was meant to master him. He performed before Queen Victoria, toured Europe, delivered scripted lines with timing, and returned to America not as a sideshow footnote, but as a headline. His height paid his passage, but his intellect paid his return. In a century when physical difference usually condemned people to invisibility or ridicule, Tom Thumb translated his difference into capital, travel, and agency. The poster reduced him to inches. History cannot reduce him so easily. Annie Jones was placed on display before she could even form a memory of why. Her beard made her profitable to others long before she learned to profit from herself. But unlike many performers of her time, she did not allow the poster to become her identity. As she matured, she challenged the legal and verbal use of the word freak, demanded fair wages, and insisted that she be billed as a performer, not a specimen. She did not abandon the stage. She reclaimed the right to exist on it as a person with agency. Her face drew crowds. Her voice rewrote the terms of the arrangement. Some performers stunned audiences by appearance alone. Randian stunned them by competence. Born without arms and legs, he chose not to vanish into the silence that society reserved for bodies like his. He learned to write, to roll and light cigarettes with his mouth, and to perform with poise and freaks and at Coney Island for years. He allowed himself to be seen, but not humiliated, seen on his own conditions, not by default of pity. Every act he performed on stage was a correction addressed to the audience's assumptions. Thousands witnessed his form. None could claim they witnessed surrender. Audiences did not come to see Mirin Dajo because he looked unusual. They came because he did the one thing the human body is not meant to do: invite a blade through it without collapsing. In the 1940s, Dajo appeared on stage and in front of scientists with swords and rods driven straight through his torso. Doctors examined the wounds, expecting shock, hemorrhage, or collapse, yet he stood, speaking calmly, as if endurance itself were a thesis he meant to defend. Some called it faith, some called it physiology, some called it a trick. But regardless of explanation, the moral challenge remained the same. What does it say about the human will when the body refuses to obey pain the way we think it should? His body did not convince everyone, but his refusal to fall forced everyone to think. If this topic moved you in any way, tap the hype button to help this story reach more people. Thank you so much. Most performers depend on training. Laurello relied on an anatomical anomaly that looked like a special effect. Nicknamed the Owl Man, he could rotate his head frighteningly close to 180 degrees, a motion that defied the logic of a human neck. In the 1930s and 40s, he toured fairs and sideshows, including Sam Wagner's at Coney Island, where the audience's reaction swung between laughter, disbelief, and discomfort. Whether the ability came from hypermobility, altered vertebrae, or lifelong conditioning, the result was the same. The body that should have stayed still turned the wrong way on command. People left unsure whether they had just witnessed a gift, a curse, or a warning about how little humans understand their own design. Some performers entertain. Laurello destabilized certainty. Unlike the people in these shows, Mike was not trained, staged, or recruited. He simply survived what should have ended him. In 1945, a farmer attempted to butcher him and missed the brainstem, leaving the chicken alive and responsive. For 18 months, Mike was fed by dropper, toured across states, and was photographed as living proof that biology could sometimes malfunction into spectacle. Crowds lined up not to applaud skill, but to stare at a loophole in nature. And yet, beneath the shock, the question was the same one that shadows every case in this history. Do we look because we are curious? Or because we are comfortable looking at life when it cannot look back at us? Mike never chose to be seen, which forces us to question why we chose to watch. When Ella Harper stepped onto the stage in the 1880s, her backward-bending knees made her movement resemble an animal more than a conventionally walking human. Posters called her the Camel Girl, turning her condition into advertisement. And yet, unlike many who were trapped in the circuit for life, Ella made a decision few could afford. She left at the height of her popularity. After earning an unusually high salary for her era, about $200 per week, she withdrew from performing and chose a private life away from posters, contracts, and staring audiences. Instead of being swallowed by the industry that once fed her, she exited before it could define her entirely. She was watched while young, but she refused to be owned by that gaze forever. Long before medicine had language for her condition, Myrtle Corbin walked into the spotlight with 2 full hips and an additional set of smaller legs. A congenital duplication that newspapers turned into a headline. Exhibited from a young age, she became one of the most promoted attractions of the late 19th century. And yet her story did not end inside the tent. She eventually married, gave birth to 5 children, and lived not as an exhibit owned by a contract, but as a wife and mother shaping an ordinary life from an extraordinary beginning. Her case reminds us that the show never contained the full biography of the people in it. The public remembered her body. The people who loved her remembered her as a person. Frank Lentini entered the circuit not as a child coerced, but as a young man who understood the math of survival. Born with a partially developed parasitic twin that left him with a 3rd leg, he turned what others would hide into an income, a passport, and a profession. He toured with Ringling Brotherscene, spoke fluently with audiences, and often joked about his condition on stage. Not out of self-hatred, but as a way to disarm cruelty before it arrived. He married, raised children, and maintained dignity in a culture that expected him to apologize for existing. Lentini did not romanticize his body, he weaponized acceptance to neutralize shame. Whose life stayed in your mind after hearing it? Type just one name in the comments. The Hilton twins began performing not by choice but by ownership. Conjoined at the hip from birth, they were controlled, transported and exhibited by guardians who profited from them for years. But unlike many who remained trapped, the sisters learned music, dance, and stagecraft until they could negotiate as performers instead of being handled as cargo. They won legal autonomy, signed independent contracts, and later appeared in film. Their story is not only about anatomy, it is about a transfer of power from the people who used them to the people they became. They were born attached to each other, not to the people who tried to own them. Not every scream inside the big tent came from danger. Some came from design. In 1952, London's Bertram Mills Circus staged a faux escape of a gorilla named Elvira. The costumed performer lunged toward the audience while clowns pretended to panic, triggering the exact mix of fear and laughter the director intended. The trick worked not because people were foolish, but because audiences in the post-war era wanted to feel something real without actually risking anything. In that sense, acts like Elvira's did not expose the animal. They exposed the appetite of the crowd. The gorilla was fake, the reaction was not. Crowds did not come to this act to see a fight. They came to see the illusion of one. The fat and skinny duo of the early 1900s used nothing but rehearsal and imbalance to manufacture laughter. One man towered and nearly vanished in height. the other absorbed the stage with his width. They fell, dodged, tangled, and collapsed with the rhythm of practiced slapstick, selling chaos that was actually choreography. It was a reminder that the circus didn't only trade in shock, it also traded in timing. People paid to watch difference, but what entertained them was precision. Of all the acts in these shows, contortion was the one that blurred the line between art and anatomy. These performers were not born finished attractions. They trained their joints and tissues until the body folded like wet cloth. They entered to quiet, not applause, because the audience did not yet know if what they were about to see was graceful or grotesque. When the spine arched backward beyond logic and the arms threaded through impossible angles, the tent went silent first, then erupted. The act succeeded not by shock, but by rearranging the viewer's map of the human limit. Contortion did not say, "Look how strange I am." It said, "You never knew the body could do this." In 1965, the Hungarian performer Károly Kováry placed 2 crocodiles into apparent trance before a full crowd in Munich. He was once a lion tamer, so the audience believed the danger was real. Whether he used touch conditioning, fatigue, or simple stagecraft mattered less than the effect. A silent reptile beside a calm man tells a louder story than a roaring cage ever could. The trick did not prove mysticism. It proved that people want to believe control is possible over the very things built to kill us. The crocodiles were still animals. The silence belonged to the crowd. At first glance, the group portraits from traveling fairs look like archives of abnormalities. But look twice and you see something else. Infrastructure. These people stood together not because they shared a diagnosis, but because they shared a payroll, a route, and a profession. They were assembled by contracts, posters, and managers, not destiny. The photo documents a workforce formed by public appetite, not by accident of birth alone. It is not a portrait of nature. It is a portrait of demand. No figure from this world has been repeated more than the alleged aristocrat, with a second face that whispered at night. Newspapers in the late 19th century printed his story as if it were a case study, not a cautionary tale about sensational journalism. No medical record, no preserved specimen, no verified portrait survives. Only text, repeated until belief replaced proof. The appeal of the story never came from him, but from us. The thrill of imagining a body so cursed it begged for surgical salvation. The myth did not survive because it was credible. It survived because humans are faster to believe horror than documentation. Do you think Edward Mordrake was real or just legend? Type one word, real or myth. A photograph from around 1900 shows a man with a visible opening in his torso, labeled as a sideshow feature, and studied by doctors of the time. Beyond the caption and repetition, little is confirmed. We do not know the medical circumstance, the outcome, or whether the exhibition was voluntary or coerced. What the image proves is not anatomy but consumption. The willingness of crowds and physicians alike to treat the rarest bodies as open books. The absence of detail is itself the indictment. The condition was not documented, but the display was. At the close of the 19th century, newspaper clippings and fair programs began mentioning a tiny boy named Dudley Foster, reportedly 5 years old and weighing no more than 5 pounds. He was shown not as a child with needs, but as living proof of extreme dwarfism, at a time when medicine could not yet explain such conditions. Almost nothing survives about his family, his care, or his fate. What survives is the narrative built around him. The less the public knew about his circumstances, the wilder the claims became. He was used to validate fear, wonder, and superstition, whatever the promoter needed the audience to feel. Dudley did not speak in the record. The world spoke over him. He lived as a boy, but history remembers him as a thesis that others wrote on his body. George and Willie Muse did not enter the circus by signing a contract. They entered it the way stolen property enters circulation. Born in the American South with albinism, the brothers were taken as boys and reintroduced to the public under the fabricated title, Men from Mars. Their hair was grown out, Their clothing was chosen for effect, and their story was told without their consent, while their mother searched for them with no idea where they had been carried. For years they were toured, advertised, and displayed for profit by men who claimed ownership over them. Only later in adulthood did the brothers secure legal rights, negotiate wages, and reunite with the family that never stopped calling them by their real names. Their story is not memorable because they looked unusual. It is memorable because they were taken before they could refuse. Their bodies made them marketable. Their abduction made them commodities. Born in New Zealand with albinism, he was sold to audiences under the fabricated identity of the wonderful Australian Aborigine, as though his skin color were proof of some ancient, mystical origin. Nothing about the story came from his own mouth. It was manufactured by circus managers who understood economics better than ethics. In the world of traveling shows, biography was not a record. It was a script. The public did not line up to understand him. They lined up to consume a story that was easier to believe than his real life. His albinism made him visually striking, and that was enough for promoters to erase everything else he actually was. You know as proof that in the circus economy, difference did not have to be real to be profitable. Laloo was born in India in 1874 with a parasitic twin attached to the front of his torso, a rare condition that would have made him a hidden shame in many households of his time. Instead, he toured through Europe and the United States in the late 19th century, displayed as a medical and theatrical attraction. What made Laloo stand apart was not the anatomy of his body, but the conduct of his mind. He spoke with audiences rather than standing in silence, answered questions without defensiveness, and explained his condition plainly without the mockery or exaggeration that promoters preferred. He used words as a shield against the reduction of his personhood. The crowd might have entered the tent expecting shock, but he guided them toward comprehension, forcing them to recognize that intelligence and dignity can live in any body, under any form. The exhibitions used his body. His voice protected his humanity. Joseph Merrick became known to the world under a name he never chose: the Elephant Man. In the late 19th century, his severely distorted bones and skin made him a commodity for showmen and a subject for physicians. Crowds paid to stare at him, and doctors wrote about him as though he could not read what they said. For years, his life was shaped by the gaze of others, a gaze that did not have to be hostile to still be dehumanizing. But when Merrick finally found a stable home under the care of Dr. Frederick Trevis at the London hospital, something different emerged. Visitors who spoke with him privately discovered eloquence, courtesy, humor, and an aching desire to be treated as ordinary. He wrote letters, collected books, and dreamed of living among people without being an object. He did not ask the world to admire him, only to stop consuming him. His deformity made him public property. His grace made him impossible to forget. Do you think these people should still be remembered today? Comment your answer. Before the word Siamese twins became a label in dictionaries, it was a headline attached to two real lives: Chang and Eng Bunker. Born in Siam in 1811 and joined at the sternum by a band of flesh, they were taken across oceans and toured before crowds who studied them as if they were evidence, not individuals. For years, they were displayed as living proof that nature could break its own rules. But when the contracts ended, they did something that defied the logic of the exhibition world more than their bodies ever did. They built an ordinary life. They married two sisters, lived as farmers and landowners in North Carolina, and together fathered 21 children. Doctors kept writing about them. Neighbors simply saw husbands, fathers, taxpayers, members of a community. Their story forces a correction to how history speaks about such performers. The tent was only one chapter, not the whole life. The world labeled them anomalies. Their descendants carried their names as a family, not a phenomenon. Grady Stiles Jr. did not enter the sideshow because he was discovered. He was born into it. He came from a family with ectrodactyly, a congenital condition that fused his fingers and toes into claw-like shapes, giving rise to the name Lobster Boy. Unlike many performers who learned the craft as adults, Grady was placed under lights as a child, passed down a stage legacy that his body never allowed him to escape. He traveled with the circus, married within the community, and raised children who inherited the same condition and the same fate of exhibition. But away from the banners and ticket lines, his life grew increasingly troubled. Alcoholism, violence, and finally a notorious murder case that turned him from a curiosity into a headline of a different kind. His biography is not a simple one of exploitation or triumph. It is the story of someone whose life was shaped by public eyes from the moment he could walk, and who never found a life outside that script. Schlitzie is one of the most recognizable faces in the history of sideshow, not because anyone knew his story, but because almost no one did. Born with severe microcephaly, Schlitzie had a childlike body and limited speech, which managers turned into a stage identity. The dress, the high-pitched vocal sounds, the primitive act. He performed with Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey, and later appeared in Todd Browning's Freaks, 1932, where his image became permanently fixed in public memory. But behind the posters was a man who was not independent, legally or practically. He was placed under guardianship, transferred between caretakers, and returned to shows because that was the only environment where he was both supervised and financially sustained. For many spectators, Schlitzie symbolized otherness. For those who worked with him, he symbolized vulnerability. A human being fully exposed to the world without the protections most of us take for granted. His condition made him watched. His dependence made him unforgettable in a way that still feels uncomfortable to admit. Stefan Bobrowski, known to the public as Lionel the Lion-Faced Man, lived with hypertrichosis, a condition that covered his face and body with long, thick hair. Barnum's publicity depicted him as half man, half beast, a living curiosity meant to collapse the boundary between human and animal. But offstage, Lionel spoke several languages, read extensively, and carried himself with refinement that contradicted every word printed on his posters. He toured Europe and America in the early 20th century, not because he worshipped fame, but because performing gave him more autonomy than the ordinary job society denied him. To the crowd, he was a mythic creature. To those who met him privately, he was gentle, articulate, and painfully aware of how spectacle rewrites identity. The public stared at the fur. The people who listened discovered a mind that was never part of the advertisement. Millie and Christine McKoy were born into conditions that stacked exploitation on top of anatomy. Conjoined twins of African-American descent, they were sold as infants to showmen who exhibited them across the United States and Europe under titles like The Two-Headed Nightingale. Their bodies earned revenue long before they earned agency. Yet over time, the sisters learned languages, trained their voices, and refined their stage presence until they were not merely displayed, they were performing. Eventually, they won legal control over their earnings and chose to continue appearing on stage as professionals, not captives. Their existence exposed two truths at once. The circus could be a machine of abuse, and it could also, once power changed hands, become a platform for autonomy. They were born joined to each other, but they refused to remain owned by anyone else. William Henry Johnson did not enter the stage as Zip. That name, and the entire character built around it, was engineered by P.T. Barnum. Johnson had microcephaly, but the circus did not sell him as a man with a medical condition. They shaved his head to a single tuft, put him in fur, and marketed him as a missing link between humans and apes. Proof, they claimed, that evolution had skipped a step. The public did not come to understand him. They came to believe a fiction. And yet, beneath the caricature, Johnson lived a long career, traveled internationally, and became financially secure in ways close to disabled men of his era outside show business. His life is not a clean story of exploitation or empowerment. It is what happens when survival is purchased at the cost of misrepresentation. The crowd never met William. They only ever met the costume built over his name. Julia Pastrana was born in Mexico with hypertrichosis and severe facial deformities that made her a target for exhibition from the moment she entered adulthood. She was taken to the United States and Europe in the 1850s and advertised not merely as unusual, but as the ugliest woman in the world. Unlike many who were displayed in silence, Julia could sing, dance, and speak multiple languages, abilities the promoters ignored because her humanity competed with the narrative they were selling. She married her manager, gave birth on tour, and died shortly after, along with her infant. The exploitation did not stop there. Her embalmed body was displayed for more than a century, long after she could consent or protest. Only in 2013, 150 years after her death, was she finally returned to Mexico for burial. Felix Wehrle became known in the early 1900s as the Elastic Man, not because he sought that identity, but because Ehlers-Danlos syndrome allowed him to stretch his skin far beyond what the public believed possible. In an era when difference was turned into income, he entered the curiosity circuit and performed across fairs and circuses, demonstrating his condition in a way that demanded attention rather than pity. What impressed audiences was not only the elasticity itself, but the calm with which he executed each display, as if to show that even an involuntary condition could be carried with discipline and composure. Medicine examined him, promoters profited from him, but between those two forces stood a man who learned to hold the gaze without surrendering his dignity. Among the performers exhibited under the Bertram Mills Circus in the early 20th century was a woman who became known in posters and newspapers as the Giraffe Neck Woman. Her elongated neck, produced by long-term use of ornamental metal rings, was framed not as a cultural practice but as a spectacle of anatomy. Unlike many curiosities that remained within the tent, she drew attention from both the paying public and medical observers who examined her appearance as if it were a scientific specimen. The Bertram Mills show, famous for combining acrobatics with human curiosities, used figures like her to ensure crowds returned year after year. We look at these photographs today with a very different heart than the audiences who once paid to see them. Time has changed our eyes, but remembering their names is one way of giving back what the world once took away: their humanity. If any part of their lives stayed with you, honor them by carrying the story forward. Let these people be remembered not as exhibits, but as lives that endured. 20 most inbred families in world history. What happens when families chase pure bloodlines at any cost? From mighty empires to forgotten villages, history is filled with rulers and communities undone by their own traditions. Join us as we uncover the shocking hidden price of inbreeding, where power, isolation, and genetics collide in stories as tragic as they are unforgettable. The Whitakers of West Virginia. Hidden away in the remote hills of odd West Virginia, there's a family whose life feels less like reality and more like something pulled straight out of a chilling Appalachian folktale. But this isn't a ghost story. It's painfully real. This is the unsettling story of the Whitakers, a family so cut off from the outside world that many of their interactions have been reduced to guttural noises, grunts, and even animal-like barks. It's not just heartbreaking, it's disturbing on a level that's hard to put into words. And no, this isn't just another strange rumor cooked up online. Back in the year 2000, photographer Mark Leda made the brave decision to step into their world and document what he found. Through his camera lens, he revealed a life most of us could never picture. A family bearing physical deformities and severe cognitive challenges, tragic outcomes of generations of inbreeding. Those haunting photographs didn't just capture faces. They exposed a hidden reality that most people would never otherwise see. But the Whitakers remain wrapped in secrecy. Folks in town, whether out of loyalty, compassion, or perhaps sheer discomfort, rarely speak openly about them. Questions linger in the air. Where did the family originally come from? Just how severe are their conditions? And why does no one give clear answers? Some whisper that the Whitakers may be distantly tied to a once prominent family in the region, though the rumors are just that. Rumors with no solid proof. Still, the mystery fuels the fascination, making their story even more haunting. Mark Leda didn't just pack up and leave after his first visit. He felt compelled to act. By launching a GoFundMe campaign, he tried to offer them some relief, shining a small light into a very dark reality. His work brought national attention to the devastating consequences of generational inbreeding, reminding us that behind every whispered legend, there are real people enduring unimaginable struggles. The Whitakers' tragedy even echoes other disturbing cases, like Australia's notorious Colt family, where isolation and secrecy created a cycle of abuse, deformity, and suffering that shocked the world. The Darwin-Wedgwood family. Charles Darwin, one of the greatest scientific minds of the 19th century, the man who gave us the theory of evolution, also lived a private life that reveals a more complicated, even troubling story. Darwin chose to marry his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, continuing a practice that was not only accepted, but often encouraged among wealthy and well-connected families of the time. Back then, cousin marriages weren't looked at as unusual or inappropriate. In fact, for the upper classes, they were considered a smart move. Families genuinely believed they were protecting what mattered most: intelligence, creativity, fortune, and social standing, by keeping those traits within their own bloodline. To them, this was less about romance and more about preserving and even enhancing a superior family legacy. But for Charles and Emma, that decision came with heartbreaking consequences. They went on to have 10 children, yet 3 of them died young. While not all the causes were carefully recorded, historians and scientists now suspect that the fragile health of the Darwin children, ranging from frequent illnesses to early deaths, was worsened by the fact that their parents were so closely related. It's a difficult truth. When families marry within their own circle, they increase the chances of harmful genetic traits being passed along. And there's a striking irony here. While Darwin himself spent his career studying heredity, variation, and the survival of the fittest in nature, his own household offered a painful, real-life example of how genetic closeness can backfire. To continue with more content, comment yes to let us know you're still following. If there's anything we can improve, take a moment to leave a comment. We're always looking to get better. Thanks so much. The Ptolemaic Dynasty. The Ptolemaic Dynasty is often remembered as the glittering final chapter of ancient Egypt's royal story. A time of towering temples, immense riches, and unforgettable figures like Cleopatra. Yet, behind all the pageantry and power lay a dangerous practice that slowly poisoned the dynasty from within: incest. It all began after the death of Alexander the Great, when his trusted general, Ptolemy I Soter, seized control of Egypt. From there, he established the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would endure for nearly 300 years. To legitimize themselves as true heirs of the pharaohs, and to present themselves as divine beings, the Ptolemies revived one of Egypt's oldest royal traditions: marrying within the family. But this wasn't about romance, and it wasn't just tradition. It was a calculated political strategy. Brothers were wed to sisters, uncles to nieces. Each union was designed to protect the throne, preserve their pure bloodline, and keep outsiders from gaining power. Over time, however, the cost of these choices became painfully clear. Generation after generation, the dynasty showed increasing signs of inbreeding depression, weakening both body and mind. If you look closely at portraits and coins from the Ptolemaic era, you'll notice that many rulers appear unusually heavy or bloated. This wasn't just an artistic quirk. Scholars now believe those features may point to inherited conditions. Diseases like Erdheim-Chester or familial multifocal fibrosclerosis that can cause swelling, obesity, and even mental decline. Passed down through their tangled family tree, these disorders may have directly undermined the dynasty's ability to govern. Perhaps the most famous example is Cleopatra VII, the last and most iconic of the Ptolemies. She married not one, but 2 of her younger brothers, continuing the very cycle that had plagued her ancestors. Cleopatra's intelligence, charisma, and political brilliance allowed her to stand toe-to-toe with powerful Romans like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But her lineage had already been weakened by centuries of inbreeding. The fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty wasn't just about Rome's rise. Its downfall was also written in its DNA. Behind the palace walls, generations of medical issues, mental instability, and internal power struggles slowly eroded the dynasty from within. By the time Rome arrived, the cracks were already so deep that the collapse of Egypt's final royal line was, in many ways, inevitable. The Bourbon dynasty. The Bourbons once stood at the center of Europe's power. For centuries, they ruled over two of the continent's greatest kingdoms, France and Spain, guiding wars, shaping alliances, and leaving behind a legacy of grandeur and influence. But hidden within all that prestige was a dangerous practice that steadily eroded their strength: inbreeding. Like many ruling dynasties of their time, the Bourbons were obsessed with preserving their royal blood. From the 1500s well into the early 1900s, marriages were carefully arranged, not for love, but for power. Cousins wed cousins, uncles married nieces, and at times the connections were even closer. To the outside world, these unions reinforced the illusion of divine right and kept political control neatly contained within the family. But beneath the gilded surface, the cost was measured in human frailty. Over the generations, troubling patterns began to emerge. The Bourbon line was plagued by infertility, hemophilia, epilepsy, and perhaps most damaging of all, severe mental illness. Modern researchers suspect that disorders such as bipolar disease and schizophrenia ran through the bloodline, fueled or even triggered by the narrowing of their genetic pool. One of the clearest examples is Philippe V of Spain, whose reign was overshadowed by deep psychological struggles. His son, Fernando VI, showed similar symptoms, evidence that these weren't isolated cases but part of a hereditary issue. By contrast, Felipe's other son, Carlos III, born to a different mother, showed no signs of mental instability. That difference suggests that introducing new genetic diversity may have acted as a safeguard, strengthening him where others had faltered. Of course, it's impossible to say with certainty that inbreeding was the sole cause of every illness or breakdown, but the consistency of these health problems across generations is too strong to dismiss. The very strategy meant to secure the dynasty's future may have instead chipped away at its vitality, weakening the very leaders who were supposed to embody its strength. Perhaps no words capture the irony of this royal paradox better than a line often attributed to a Bourbon monarch. "Now I might have my enemies, but I have the adoration of my people. You think because I'm king that I'm not also a brother?" In those words lies the tragic truth, that the power of the crown was built on the same family ties that would one day undermine it: the British royal family. The British royal family, famous, influential, and inseparable from the history of the modern world. Yet behind the glittering crowns, state ceremonies, and carefully painted portraits lies a legacy that is far less celebrated, a hidden trail of inherited illnesses born out of centuries of carefully arranged intermarriages. For generations, Britain's monarchs married strategically, linking their bloodlines with other European royals. These marriages were never just about love. They were political maneuvers, designed to secure the throne, strengthen alliances, and expand influence across the continent. But as those family ties grew closer and closer, a hidden danger began to surface: the risk of passing along serious genetic disorders. One of the most well-known and still debated examples is King George III, often remembered as the Mad King. Throughout his reign, he suffered repeated bouts of mental instability, with symptoms ranging from severe confusion to terrifying hallucinations. Some historians and medical experts believe he had porphyria, a rare inherited disorder that affects the nervous system and can cause unusual symptoms, even turning urine a bluish-purple color. Others argue that his struggles may have been the result of bipolar disorder. Whatever the true diagnosis, many agree that his health was likely made worse by the close interbreeding of Europe's royal families. Ironically, the very tradition meant to keep the monarchy strong may have left one of its rulers more vulnerable. But perhaps the most devastating example of this genetic legacy was hemophilia, a condition where the blood fails to clot properly, turning even small cuts or bruises into life-threatening injuries. Hemophilia entered the royal bloodline through Queen Victoria, who carried the gene and unknowingly passed it to her descendants. Her son, Prince Leopold, lived a short life plagued by the disease, and through her daughters, the gene spread quickly into other royal households across Europe, including those of Spain, Germany, and most famously Russia. It was this spread that gave hemophilia its grim nickname, the royal disease. Across Europe, it caused tragedy after tragedy, young princes and heirs dying far too early, and royal families living in constant fear of accidents that could prove fatal. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt. When we hear names like Tutankhamun, Ramses II, and Cleopatra VII, our minds immediately fill with images of golden tombs, massive temples, and rulers worshipped as if they were gods themselves. Yet, beneath that glittering surface of ancient Egypt's royal legacy lies a darker, more troubling truth. Systematic inbreeding that left deep, lasting scars on the bloodline of the pharaohs. In Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't simply a king. He was believed to be a living god, a direct link between the heavens and the earth. Protecting that sacred status became the highest priority, and to do so, the royal family relied on a very deliberate strategy: marrying within their own ranks. Brothers wed sisters, uncles married nieces. It wasn't about love or choice, but about preserving the divine image and keeping the royal bloodline pure. This practice reinforced the pharaoh's right to rule, but the cost of maintaining that so-called purity was incredibly steep. Take the most famous case, Tutankhamun, the boy king whose reign was short and whose life ended tragically young. Thanks to modern DNA testing and scientific research, we now know he suffered from a range of genetic disorders: a clubfoot, scoliosis, and a weakened immune system. His parents weren't just related, they were full siblings. Tutankhamun's fragile health was more than bad luck. It was the inevitable outcome of centuries of inbreeding that valued legacy over biology. Even legendary figures like Ramses II, remembered for his strength and military might, and Cleopatra VII, admired for her intelligence and charm, came from the same tightly closed gene pool. While the exact effects of inbreeding on them are harder to trace, it's likely they too carried unseen consequences of a dynasty built on marrying within the family. And it wasn't just a choice made by a few rulers. For well over 1,000 years, this practice of sibling and close relative marriage was not only common, but expected among Egyptian royalty. To them, the divine bloodline had to remain untouched, even if it meant passing along hidden weaknesses, frailty, or illnesses that could shorten lives. From powerful dynasties like the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, and the British royal family to the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, the obsession with pure bloodlines led to countless tragedies. In your opinion, what costly lessons has humanity learned from the trade-off between power and genetic health? The Colt family of Australia. The Colt family, a name that would become forever linked to one of the most disturbing and eye-opening cases in modern Australian history. In 2012, authorities stumbled upon a shocking reality hidden in the remote countryside of New South Wales. A family living in near total isolation, bound together not just by blood, but by a chilling cycle of inbreeding, secrecy, and generational neglect. What investigators uncovered went far beyond the image of a troubled household. It was a tangled web of abuse spanning multiple generations, where many family members didn't even know the identity of their biological parents. Children were born from unions between siblings, cousins, and in some instances, even closer relations. Their compound lacked running water, proper sanitation, or any form of schooling. The physical conditions were appalling, but even more heartbreaking were the emotional scars carried by the children growing up in such an environment. The official investigation revealed a community cut off so completely that basic moral, social, and legal boundaries had broken down entirely. And it left Australians asking haunting questions. How could something like this happen in a modern, developed nation? How had it gone unnoticed for so long? And why didn't anyone step in earlier to stop it? The Colt case became a wake-up call across Australia. It highlighted glaring flaws in the country's welfare, education, and community systems, gaps that had allowed a family like this to remain hidden in plain sight for decades. It also forced difficult conversations about the urgent need for early intervention, better reporting systems, and stronger protections for vulnerable children, especially in remote or overlooked communities. The Fugate family of Kentucky. The story of the Fugates, living deep in the quiet hills of Kentucky's Appalachian region, stands as one of the most unusual and visually unforgettable cases of inherited genetics in American history. It all started in the early 1800s, when Martin Fugate and his wife, Elizabeth Smith, both unknowingly carrying the same rare recessive gene, settled near a small place called Troublesome Creek. What followed was a remarkable multi-generation saga of isolation, intermarriage, and a condition that gave the family a name the world would never forget: the Blue Fugates. The medical explanation for their striking appearance is methemoglobinemia, a rare blood disorder that affects the way oxygen moves through the body. The result was a distinct bluish tone to the skin, most visible in the lips, hands, and face. When 4 of Martin and Elizabeth's 7 children were born with this unusual coloring, it was clear that the recessive gene had found a foothold. And in such a remote, secluded region, that genetic legacy spread quickly. Geography played a major role in what happened next. With so few families moving in and limited chances to marry outside the community, people often married within the same tight circle. It wasn't necessarily by choice, it was simply the reality of life in the mountains. Over time, marriages between cousins, and even cases like Zachariah Fugate marrying his own aunt, helped ensure the gene remained in circulation, passing from one generation to the next. Among the many family members, one figure became especially well known: Luna Fugate, remembered as the bluest of them all. Luna's complexion was a deep, vivid blue, yet she still led a rich and enduring life. She married, raised 13 children, and lived until the age of 84. Many of her children carried the same skin tone, but accounts suggest that aside from their unusual coloring, they were strong, healthy, and capable people. Perhaps the most moving glimpse into their perspective comes from a family member, once asked a simple but profound question: if you could change back to the way you were, would you do it? The answer came after a pause: I'm not sure, really. That quiet response speaks volumes. It reflects both acceptance of their unique identity and the complicated feelings of carrying a legacy that made them famous for all the wrong reasons. After hearing the heartbreaking stories of the Whitaker, Colt, and Fugate families, what surprised or haunted you the most about the effects of isolation and inbreeding in these cases? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The global history of inbreeding. Inbreeding, the marriage or union of close relatives, might sound shocking, even disturbing to us today. But if you look back through history, it was far more common than most people realize. And it wasn't always about a lack of options. More often, it was fueled by tradition, power, and the belief that keeping bloodlines pure would preserve strength, status, or even divinity. In the world's earliest civilizations, where kings and emperors were seen as gods on earth, marrying within the family wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Ancient Egypt offers one of the clearest examples. Pharaohs were considered divine beings, and to protect that sacred image, they often married their sisters or close relatives. The famous union of Akhenaten and Nefertiti wasn't just political, it was deeply spiritual, a symbolic way of keeping divine authority locked inside the bloodline. But Egypt was hardly unique. Centuries later in Europe, the same idea appeared in royal dynasties like the House of Habsburg, one of the most powerful families in history. For generation after generation, they arranged strategic marriages within their own circle, hoping to consolidate power and keep outsiders at bay. The result was devastating. A host of genetic disorders, the most famous being the so-called Habsburg jaw, a severe protrusion of the lower jaw that left some family members struggling to chew or even speak clearly. Along with that came infertility, frailty, and other health problems that slowly eroded their ability to lead. Outside the gilded walls of royal courts, geography sometimes played the same role. On Tristan da Cunha, a tiny island in the South Atlantic Ocean, residents were so cut off from the outside world that marrying within the small community became inevitable. Over generations, intermarriage wasn't a choice but a necessity, and it led to inherited health conditions that shaped life on the island. Here, inbreeding wasn't about ambition or power, it was simply survival in isolation. So when we look at inbreeding through the lens of history, it becomes clear that this wasn't a rare or isolated phenomenon. It happened across continents, cultures, and classes. For some, it was about preserving wealth or royal status. For others, it was about maintaining a divine image. And in places cut off from the world, it was about survival. But the outcome was often the same: a shrinking gene pool that carried hidden costs, from physical deformities to fragile health, and sometimes even the downfall of entire dynasties. The genetic consequences of inbreeding. For centuries, people had noticed that when close relatives married, something often went wrong. Children from these unions were more likely to be sickly, fragile, or to suffer from mysterious conditions that no one could fully explain. But it wasn't until the 19th century, through the quiet, careful work of a monk named Gregor Mendel, that the science behind these troubling patterns began to make sense. Mendel's simple experiments with pea plants uncovered the hidden rules of heredity, how traits are passed from one generation to the next. His findings were revolutionary. He showed that when two individuals share too much of the same genetic material, the risk of harmful recessive traits being expressed rises dramatically. In most cases, a dominant healthy gene masks a recessive faulty one. But in close relative pairings, both parents are far more likely to carry the same defective gene. That means their children have a higher chance of inheriting two copies of that flaw. And when that happens, genetic disorders can emerge in devastating ways. By the early 20th century, the science advanced even further. Sir Ronald Fisher, a pioneering statistician and geneticist, created a formula called the coefficient of inbreeding. For the first time, scientists could measure with numbers the exact probability that a child would inherit two identical genes from a shared ancestor. Fisher's work didn't just confirm what people had long suspected. It gave researchers and doctors a predictive tool to understand and even anticipate the dangers of inbreeding. And this isn't just theoretical science. The effects can be seen in real communities. One striking example comes from Pingelap, a remote island in Micronesia. In the 18th century, a catastrophic typhoon wiped out nearly the entire population, leaving only a few dozen survivors. With so few people left, generations of intermarriage were unavoidable. Over time, a rare genetic condition, achromatopsia, complete colorblindness, spread through the island. Today, a significant portion of Pingelap's population sees the world only in shades of black and white. What had once been an uncommon mutation became widespread simply because of a genetic bottleneck and the unavoidable cycle of inbreeding. Fortunately, modern science has given us tools to break that cycle. Genetic counseling and medical screening now help families understand their risks before having children. In parts of the world where inbreeding is still practiced, whether because of cultural traditions or geographic isolation, these tools are critical in protecting future generations from preventable suffering. With the severe genetic consequences now clearly explained by science, what do you think we can do to use advances in genetics and counseling to prevent such tragedies in the future? Do you believe science has the power to completely change this picture? The Habsburg Dynasty. For centuries, the Habsburgs weren't just rulers. They were the ultimate power brokers of Europe. Their sprawling family tree connected empires, their marriages shaped political landscapes, and their name became almost interchangeable with royalty itself. Yet, behind the glittering halls of their palaces and the heavy crowns on their heads lay a darker truth, one that would eventually weaken and even destroy their legacy: the devastating impact of inbreeding. The Habsburgs had a strategy, and on the surface it made perfect sense. They married with precision, linking their bloodline to other monarchies, securing alliances, and tightening their grip on vast territories. At first, it was a winning formula. Their influence grew, their reigns lasted, and outsiders were kept at a distance. But slowly, that plan turned inward. In their determination to keep the royal blood pure, they began arranging marriages between close relatives: cousins, uncles and nieces, even aunts and nephews. The cost of these unions wasn't visible right away, but it grew heavier and more tragic with every generation. Imagine the royal court in all its splendor: massive chandeliers casting light over gold-trimmed walls, nobles dressed in silks and jewels. And among all that grandeur, heirs were being born with visible signs of genetic strain. None became more infamous than what history calls the Habsburg jaw. This wasn't just a minor quirk of appearance, it was a severe deformity. A jaw so enlarged and protruding that some members of the family struggled to chew food properly or even speak clearly. And that was only one of many consequences of their narrowing gene pool. By the late 1500s, the damage, especially within the Spanish Habsburg branch, was undeniable. Children were born sickly and frail. Many died in infancy, while others grew into adulthood plagued by chronic illnesses, weakness, or mental impairment. Yet the cycle continued, driven by fear that marrying outsiders might cost them their power. In their eyes, preserving the dynasty mattered more than the health of the family itself. The most heartbreaking symbol of this decline arrived in 1700 with the death of King Charles II of Spain. He was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, and his life embodied the dynasty's downfall. Sickly and infertile, he suffered from severe physical deformities and cognitive struggles. Unable to produce an heir, he marked the end of his branch of the family line. With his death, centuries of Spanish Habsburg power collapsed, not through war or revolution, but through the slow, painful consequences of their own choices. The Pitcairn Islanders. It all started back in 1789 with one of history's most famous mutinies, the uprising aboard the HMS Bounty. A group of desperate sailors, worn down by the brutal discipline of the British Navy, turned against their commander and vanished into the wide, uncharted Pacific. They weren't just fleeing a ship, they were chasing the dream of a life lived on their own terms. Their search brought them to Pitcairn Island, a tiny, remote patch of land hidden far from any authority. There, together with several Tahitian women they had brought with them, the mutineers carved out a new settlement. But cut off from the rest of the world, what developed wasn't just a community. It became a fragile social experiment, one shaped by isolation, secrecy, and the inevitable pressures of a limited gene pool. By 1817, nearly all of the original mutineers were gone. Only John Adams remained, carrying on after the death of Ned Young, who had helped him lay the groundwork for a new society. Adams leaned heavily on the Bible, using religion as the backbone for law and order on the island. On the surface, this gave the community structure, but underneath that order, life was far more complicated and far more troubling. As generations passed, the population grew slowly, eventually peaking at around 200 people by the year 1936. Yet, in such an isolated place where every family was closely connected and outside norms had long since disappeared, dark patterns began to take hold. Sexual abuse, especially involving minors, quietly became normalized, passed down as if it were simply part of island life. Hidden from the world, these practices spread from one generation to the next. The truth didn't come to light until the early 2000s, when New Zealand authorities launched an investigation that shocked the outside world. What they uncovered were decades of abuse, with some of the island's most prominent men, including community leaders, convicted of crimes against children. For the first time, Pitcairn was forced to confront the darkest parts of its history. Today, fewer than 50 people still call Pitcairn home. They remain cut off, carrying the weight of a painful legacy that left scars stretching across generation and hope. Thank you for watching. If this video moved you, please tap the hype button, leave a comment, and consider liking and sharing it so these stories are not forgotten. Thank you so much.